Welcome to the Divorce Podcast, a podcast that aims to address divorce, separation and co-parenting here in the UK, countering the often sensationalist way it's portrayed in the media, challenging the status quo and driving for reform. On each episode, I'm joined by experts to discuss divorce, separation and co-parenting from different angles and to give their opinions and to debate them. I'm Kate Daly, a relationship counsellor and divorce coach, co-founder of Amicable, the divorce services company, and host of this, the Divorce Podcast. In this episode, I was joined by Jo Middleton, who's the creator of the award-winning parenting blog, Slummy Mummy, and solo parent to two daughters now aged 27 and 20. Jo had her first child aged 17 in the middle of her A-levels and is now 44 and a granny to a 3-year-old. We talk about Jo's mixed experience, her words, of relationships and co-parenting and her journey over the last 10 years as a solo mum. We explore the benefits of being a single parent, as well as the daily struggles and the idea of loneliness when you don't have a partner or co-parent to lean on. Jo shares her tips on things you can do to make the solo parent journey easier. And what I hope more than anything that this episode does is to highlight that not everyone is able to co-parent. And if that's where you find yourself, rather than beat yourself up about it, you have an episode where we celebrate your solo effort and talk about the things that have made it both hard and joyous for Jo and I. If you really loved this episode or want to hear more episodes like this, then please make sure to rate us on your preferred listening platform. Enjoy the episode. Welcome, Jo.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Oh, it's lovely to see you. Thank you for joining us. Now, I just wanted to sort of say at the outset of this podcast, we bang on a lot on this podcast about co-parenting and the benefits thereof and all the rest of it. But I think it's worth recognising that for some of us, and I include myself in this, co-parenting just hasn't been an option. So I'm really pleased today that we have the chance to talk about the trials and tribulations and the joys of solo parenting. So I'm delighted that we're able to look at that in a bit more detail. But I wonder, Jo, because I think we all maybe describe it slightly differently. What do you mean by being a solo parent?
Well, I guess there's a slight sort of, complication's the wrong word, but my situation is possibly a little bit different from some people's in that my daughters have different fathers and my relationships with them have been quite different. So, like you said, I was 17 when my eldest daughter, who's now 27, was born, and her father was a year younger than me, so he was actually still at school when I was pregnant, so don't tell anyone. And we stayed together for about 18 months after she was born, so we were together for about 3 years in all. And he's been in her life throughout, I would say, with the caveat being that I think because I was young and quite inexperienced generally in life, my expectations of him as a co-parent were fairly low. So like it didn't even occur to me after we separated that we would have like a shared responsibility in the sense of 50-50 time or anything. It was very much she would go and stay for a night a week, or, she might go for the day on Sunday. And he was obviously very young and not earning very much either. So the kind of financial contribution that he was able to make was small. So I would say that although I haven't I've got no complaints in the sense that he's never done anything horribly wrong, I've never really felt like I was in a kind of shared parenting relationship there. Yeah, I pretty much felt sort of on my own really in terms of having somebody to kind of talk through decisions with or, share concerns with.
I think that's it, isn't it? It's having to make all of the decisions, isn't it? And knowing that ultimately the buck stops with you. I guess one of the benefits of that is you can make some decisions much quicker because you're not having to involve the other parent, or, there isn't somebody else's sort of opinion or concerns to take into account. But it's pretty lonely, is it?
Yeah, and I guess it's interesting you say about sort of taking somebody else's opinion into account, because I do wonder as well on reflection whether I didn't kind of facilitate a better relationship, whether if that had happened and I was older, whether my expectations might have been higher, but also I very much kind of took charge, I think, of the parenting from day one. And perhaps I could have been more trusting or more, more open to sharing that responsibility, which I think is difficult, isn't it? Because you're making yourself really vulnerable if you're kind of opening yourself up to sort of sharing that responsibility. But, I've always been a very kind of capable person. And I think it's easy as that kind of person to sort of take over, isn't it? And just think, all right, well, I'm going to make all the decisions and not maybe give somebody the opportunity to prove themselves or to sort of take on that responsibility.
And I wonder if it's not also about the sort of society we live in, the people surrounding us and the expectations, because you're talking about a situation. Did you say your daughter's 20?
Yeah, so she's...
Oh, so this is 27, this one, isn't it?
Mid-90s,
so,
yeah.
Yeah, so 27 years ago, the parenting landscape probably looked very different, even along gendered roles. There's a lot more expectation, there's a lot more shared parenting, there's a lot more kind of doing things together. We know a lot more about how we get better outcomes, that kind of stuff. But in, like you say, in the 1990s is what you experienced, a reflection of how life was in those days.
Yeah, and I think also a reflection of my sort of existing family setup, because my mum and dad separated when I was 12. And my mum was always very much, I can do this by myself. I don't need, even though my dad was always in our lives, I didn't feel like the model that they gave me wasn't a sort of shared parenting model. It was that, we'll go and see him for a day at the weekend. And my mum's mum as well, my gran, was a very sort of strong female figure. So I think we're quite sort of like a matriarchal dynamic in our family that would probably I assumed that I would be the one who would be in charge, I guess, and take on the responsibility. Yeah, so that's the experience I had with my oldest daughter. And then my youngest daughter, who's now 20, I was in a relationship with her father for 9 years, basically the whole of my 20s. And we separated when Belle was 6. And that was quite a different experience, because although I initially, for the sort of first few years after we separated, tried really hard to sort of facilitate a relationship between them, he had quite a lot of personal struggles that ended, up with it becoming just sort of more hurtful and more difficult for her to have a relationship with him than to not. And so eventually, when she was about 9 or 10 years old, she sort of decided that she didn't want to have that relationship, that she found it too difficult. And that's kind of been it really for the last 10 years. So no sort of financial support, no contact at all. So yeah, so that's kind of my definition of solo parenting there. And I will have always kind of kept it open as an option for her, and, said that obviously I would do anything I could to make it feel comfortable for her, or to support her if that was what she wanted to do. But it's not been something that's happened.
And so when you get to that stage with the children where ultimately, and you've had to obviously do it a couple of times, you're talking about the way that things are going to be, what do you say at the very beginning of those conversations then? Because I presume you don't really have a plan, do you? And we all get very obsessed with making sure we tell kids what's going on and only talking to them when things are changing. But in that circumstance, what sort of things did you say to each of yours? Because it's two very different circumstances, which actually makes it very interesting.
Well, I guess, so B, my oldest daughter, was only about 2 when we separated. So there wasn't really a sort of conversation to be had as such, I don't think, for her, other than, possibly a one-sided one of, I'm sure at the time I did kind of explain in simple terms what might be happening, and sort of, talk about it as part of like everyday life and everyday conversation. I think I remember with Belle, it was something that I think had been on the cards for a long time in my mind. And when it did actually happen and we did separate, I think I probably told both of them, because obviously, Belle's dad had been in B's life as well for a long time. So it was a big, it was a thing for her as well. I told them quite quickly and quite in a quite straightforward way. And I think part of the reason, if I'm honest, was that I wanted to make it real so that I couldn't back out of it. If that makes sense. Because it had, instances in the past where I'd wanted to separate, or I'd kind of expressed that I wasn't happy in the relationship, and yet somehow I was still in it. And I think the act of telling the children was something that I wanted to do in order to show him that I was serious about it, and to sort of show myself, I guess, that I was serious about it too.
So when you started that journey then of being a solo parent, obviously you didn't necessarily label it that way, because I guess you didn't know that that's how things were going to work out at the time. Did you have some interim arrangements? Like, how did you start off the whole, well, this is how we're going to look after our daughter, particularly when you were young and 17? What did you start off by doing? I
don't think in either case there was anything very formal. I certainly wouldn't have even thought about, any kind of outsider being involved, sort of a mediation process or anything like that. It was very much like a week by week, I think, even not even necessarily a sort of fixed routine, but can she come and see you this week? Okay, well, how about this day? I think in relationships generally, I'm not especially good at asking for what I want or need. I'm try and be accommodating, I guess, which is probably why I've not had the most successful relationships, because I think, it's good to be able to say what you want, isn't it? And kind of have a few more boundaries in place. But so I was and went along, I guess, with whatever I was offered. And I guess sort of, from a children's point of view, that's not the most ideal situation, because you don't then have that sort of the predictability of you knowing that you're always going to be somewhere on a Wednesday, or you're always going to be somewhere at weekends.
But also, I guess what I'm guessing at is that the conversations so often are focused around what's been called contact, or when you're going to see the other parent. And I guess as we go through these journeys, what I've taken away and what I've realised is parenting relationship is so much more than when you see the child or your child. It's all of the other big decisions. It's all of the other walking alongside stuff that very often don't get discussed, because the focus has always been on what's the contact pattern, when you're going to see. If you're the non-resident parent, it's always been about, when are you going to see them, and not how are you going to be involved in their lives on a minute by minute, hour by hour basis that doesn't revolve around you being physically present or there. And I think that's the bit that sometimes is the harder stuff.
I think that, yeah. And, that's so interesting, isn't it? Because you asked me that question and my answer was about contact and when they saw them, And
I wasn't trying to set you up, because I hadn't thought about that until we started to talk about it. Just suddenly as you were talking, I was like thinking, gosh, yes, it always comes down to when are we going to see, when are we going to see this child, rather than actually a relationship is more than
being in a room with somebody. And that, I think, is what has always been missing, has been that, there was very much that focused on, okay, well, I will meet you in this lay-by and hand her over at 6 p.m. for the weekend, with no real discussion in between about anything else, like a sort of parenting style, or none of the big topics like that, or the kind of little stuff like any of the kind of the big landmarks or the discussions you might have at certain ages. No, absolutely none of that. I wonder if perhaps that is easier nowadays with more ways to communicate, because 20 years ago, if you weren't in the same room as your child, you could phone them on a telephone, but you wouldn't be able to FaceTime or video chat, or even kind of have a exchange of messages on WhatsApp or share photos or something. So, but perhaps that made it more difficult. But I
think you're right. I think we that we say technology's got a lot to answer for in terms of impoverishing communication and replacing face-to-face. But where face-to-face isn't possible for whatever the reason, then there is so much more of a relationship you can have nowadays, isn't there? And it's It's the being right there in the moment stuff that technology allows you to do. Like, my son often watches the football with his dad, as in they're on some device or other, both staring at a separate television 300 miles apart, but they're connected because they're watching it on their phone as well. Do you know what I mean? So they're on the telephone watching the football, and because nobody pays for calls and minutes anymore and that kind of, so it's not a big deal to be able to do that kind of stuff. And then they're sharing in the moment. And I just think that actually that then changes the dynamic of this notion of solo parenting as well for me as well. I feel in the more latter years, I feel less like a solo parent, even though I might still have all of the time. The kids live with me full time, and very rarely, because of location and various other factors, do they actually spend much time with their dad. So I guess it's that, isn't it? It's just that it does.
Yeah. And I wonder too if it works the other way around as well, because I know when B, my older daughter, was sort of 7, 8, 9, I think it was after Belle was born, and so Belle was at home, and I think going to her dad's for the weekend felt like she wasn't keen on it. She didn't really enjoy it. It felt like quite a wrench for her, I think, to be taken out of the kind of family setting. And whether maybe if she'd been able to be in touch with me while she was away more easily, that would have made it easier for her. Because her like ideal Saturday night would be to be sat at home with me watching Blind Date, which shows how long ago it was. And perhaps if she could have been at her dad's and like with your son and the football watching Blind Date with me, or even just able to message me and kind of say something about the contestants, whether it would just kind of soften it and make it feel like less of a kind of, you're in one place and you're in the other place. And
less digital, less black and white. Yes, exactly.
Yeah,
less all or nothing.
Yeah. I think that would definitely have made it easier for her.
And it is, when you have got all of that responsibility, it can be, overwhelming at times, I know. But from your perspective, what has been your biggest struggle, would you say?
I think it's that what you're saying about the responsibility and the decision making is the day-to-day stuff is the kind of things you can just get on with, like obviously nobody wants to be the one cooking dinner every single night for 20 years, but you get, that's life, isn't it? You get on with that. But I think it's the having the second opinion, having somebody who will be a sounding board, having somebody who will share in those big decisions with you. And I think that's why often single or solo parents can get a little bit defensive when perhaps kind of like married people say, oh, well, my partner works away a lot, and so I know what it's like being a single parent. And you're like, okay, like, what it's like maybe for a week to have to do all the washing yourself. But do you really know what it's like to be choosing a secondary school and have no idea if it's the right choice for your child and have nobody to share that decision with? Do you know what it's like to be going through like diagnosis of a health condition and to not know if you're doing the right thing, or, so I think that's quite a lot of single parents, I think, get slightly defensive about that, don't they?
I definitely share that. For me, it's when mine say, oh, I can't come out this week because my husband's working away. And I think, well, I have to get a babysitter every time I step out the door. Why are you any different? I can't pay for a babysitter. I'm not going to pay for a babysitter. My husband's away. It's like, oh no, come on.
Yeah. The other thing I think that grates on me sometimes is when you say you're a single parent, is that a lot of people assume that means either that you just get loads of child maintenance or that you have every weekend free. And then you're like, no, I don't. Unless I organise childcare, I have no time free at all.
Yeah, and that's definitely hard when they're little and you literally can't step out the house. I remember considering whether actually getting a babysitter so I could go for a 45-minute run was actually a worthwhile investment. Well, would I go insane if I didn't do it? Or was it insane to do it? And I just couldn't quite ever come down on the right side of that. And
there's a relentlessness, isn't there, I think? And it can feel quite isolating and make you feel quite trapped, I think, unless you have some support. And I've always been really lucky to have a really supportive family. So my mum in particular, I can't imagine if I'd been sort of living the opposite end of the country or, not had that support, sort of emotional and and practical. And the practical stuff was what was massively important when I was younger, for being able to study and then work. And, I wouldn't have been able to do that without them.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's right. Having some kind of support network is really important, which is why, finding other people in your situation is so key, because they understand the stresses, and the help that people in the same situation can offer is usually, good quality help, isn't it? If you've got friends or family who just get your situation.
So I was really lucky when Belle was sort of primary school age, that I had a friend who had a son who was the same age as her. And I don't have many other single or solo parent friends, but she was like my one single parent friend. And that made such a difference, because we were able to do things like go on holidays together. I mean, taking children, especially young children, on holiday as a single parent, like, it's not really fun. Like, it might be fun if you're really wealthy and you can go somewhere and put them in clubs and just lounge by the pool. But if you're doing like a self-catering in South Wales and it's raining and you're like, well, this is just like being at home, except I've got less of myself. Yeah. So, being able to go away with her and sort of share that responsibility a little bit, and also have another grown up to talk to, was hugely valuable. And also for Belle, because the 7 years between my children. And so when the eldest was sort of in her teens, she wasn't massively keen on hanging out with us 7, 8-year-old. So, it was lovely for her too, that it wasn't just, me and her in the wet camping field.
I think the other thing from a child's perspective as well is, when you are faced with obviously having to do things as a single parent, whichever parent you are, the resident or the non-resident parent, your kids become way more capable. My kids from a very young age had to pull their own suitcases because I didn't have 3 hands. You know what I mean? So they had to be able to pack for them, pack a bag that they could carry, and they had to be able to wheel their suitcases. They had to be able to get on and off a train and those sorts of things, because you physically, don't have enough hands to be able to do that kind of thing. And they get used to, being that little bit more independent and being that little bit more capable. And so I think that's definitely one of the things I've taken from this. I had a very different childhood to my kids, in the sense that I had 2 parents that stayed together, and stay-at-home mom, nice holidays, all of that sort of thing. And I was useless by the time I got to university. I practically had a nervous breakdown because I could do absolutely nothing for myself.
Well, when Bea went to university, she was the only person in her flat of 8 people who knew how to use a washing machine.
Yeah. Because it's a team effort, isn't it? When you're doing solo parenting, one of the things I like about it is that, your family is a team and everyone's got to pitch in. And, those things seem quite normal even 20 years ago, but now that doesn't seem to be the case so much anymore. Kids don't seem very practically minded. Lots of kids don't pitch in, but, being a solo parent, they have to. And I like the impact that has on them. I think that's a positive thing.
Yeah, definitely. I agree. I think they can perhaps be a little bit wiser as well. I know what experiences like having your parents separate can be traumatic, but they are also learning experiences, aren't they? It's real life, and that kind of thing happens in real life. And, there's a lot you can learn from even the most difficult of circumstances, I think. I hope.
What do you think are the benefits and the advantages of solo parenting? Do you think there are any?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I love the freedom. I think I would really struggle with this kind of the having to consider somebody else's point of view. That doesn't make me sound too selfish. Or to accommodate, like, if somebody had a completely different style of parenting to me, I think I would find that difficult. So I really like the freedom. Do you know what I actually like as well is I like that when something goes really well, or when my kids do something that I'm really proud of, I think, yeah, that's all me. I can obviously they get to take some credit for it, but from a sort of parenting perspective, I can take, all the credit for that. Don't have to share that.
I think, I've had various things with my kids with their own sort of personal mental health along the journey. And I think one of the things that whenever I've had to interact with people that have been helping us, is they've always said that consistent parenting is really key. And so whatever the sort of difficulty that the kids have had, they've had consistent parenting. It might be consistently bad, but they've had consistent parenting because it's only been me. And with some of my friends where they are co-parenting and they've had, issues, it's been really hard when you've got parents on different pages, and because you haven't got the glue of the marriage anymore, you've got two parents who want to do it in a really different way. And I guess I'm thinking about that in terms of, we mentioned in the intro that one of your children have been diagnosed with ASD. And I just wonder, has that been easier, harder to cope with being a solo parent? I guess there's advantages and disadvantages, aren't there?
And it's hard to know, isn't it? Because you don't know. I think sometimes when you're on your own, you kind of can paint this sort of rosy picture of what it would be like if there were two parents, and it would just mean you had all this extra support and somebody to help you. But actually, it might not be like that. The reality of it might be that you had very different approaches to it, and that it caused a lot of conflict, or that, so I think it's hard to say whether it's easier or harder because you don't know what it would have been like under different circumstances. But I do think it's important to kind of be realistic about what the relationship might have looked like, and not to just imagine that everybody in a couple is living this incredibly wonderful, supportive kind of relationship. The sort of diagnosis process I found quite difficult on my own, in terms of just not knowing what I was doing and not knowing who I was meant to be going to for help, or what I was meant to be doing for the best. But then I've got that family still, so that it's not like I feel completely alone. And, we're very close as a family, me and my children. And like you say, when you go to things like appointments and, somebody, and I'm there with her, everybody always says, to her, well, you're obviously very close to your mum, and it's lovely that you've got your mum to talk to. And, that's, so, that closeness, I don't know whether that would be quite the same if it wasn't just the two of us.
It's hard, isn't it? And I wonder, even I think about when I'm asking you the questions, why I'm so determined to find out whether it's better or worse. But it's interesting, isn't it? Well, you sort of always trying to compare, would it be better with two parents or one parent, rather than just let's accept that we are where we are. The reasons why we're here almost don't matter, but we are where we are as solo parents, and therefore it's just really for us about, what works, what doesn't work, isn't it? Rather than what's better or what isn't better.
It's that whole thing, isn't it, of like being sort of like a season or a chapter, this is where we are. It doesn't matter what's brought you to this position or whether you might be better off in different circumstances. This is your life now, and how are you going to live that to make it the best version for everybody in the family? I think that's all it comes down to, really, isn't it? But I know what you mean. I went to a festival a couple of years ago, and I remember looking around at the kind of the families, with the little kids in the pull-along trucks, and sort of the dads are in charge of the coats and pulling these kids along, and getting quite sort of sentimental about it, thinking, well, I'm never going to have that. But then at the same time, you'd kind of overhear like little snippets of conversation, and the mum was clearly annoyed, or the dad was fed up with having to pull this truck along, and the kids are crying. And it's just a reminder, isn't it, that everybody has stuff in their life that is difficult, or there's not like a perfect scenario. It's just about making the best of whatever situation you're in.
And I think from like the co-parenting or the post-divorce narrative, it's really about trying to help people find what works for them, isn't it? Whatever, as you say, however you've got here is how you've got here. But if you are in this position where you are a solo parent, then what actually makes it work? What do you find helps, Jo?
I think there's having some support, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a partner or another parent, but whether that's your family or whether that's, friends who you bring into your life as family, just having anybody who kind of understands you and understands your situation that you can perhaps offload to a little bit. And I think this sounds like a really real cliche, but not being afraid to ask for help or support. But I try and think of it the other way around. Like if somebody asks me for help, I always feel flattered, and I always want to help them, and I always feel pleased that they felt able to ask or able to trust me. And I'm always really keen to help. And I think, well, actually, if by asking other people for help, you're just giving them that feeling, then that's a win-win for both of you, isn't it? You can't be a martyr to it. You can't think just because you're the only parent that that's it. You've got to sacrifice everything that you enjoy doing or want to do. So yeah, don't be afraid to get that babysitter for the 45-minute run, I say.
Yeah, well, it's hard though, isn't it? It is hard to ask for help. And I don't know what stops us. And sometimes I think for me, it's about not wanting to impose on what I see as an other sort of family. And I try and work through in my mind what the impact of me asking might be on the husband and the husband's friend's brother. And I just think, no, just stop, just ask. You have to have confidence that people will say no if they can't do it.
You have to
just
trust
leave it there and not be offended.
Yeah, you have to trust that other people need to have their own boundaries. And if they don't want to do it, they can say no. And that's their responsibility, isn't it? You can just ask. Yeah.
Do you think there are things that make it harder? Are there things that we could change as a society that would make, this job easier for parents?
I think the practical stuff and the financial stuff is definitely makes it more difficult. And that then feeds into the isolation and the loneliness, I think, because if you don't have, you just don't have as much money because there's only one of you, and going to things like on holiday or going for days out, everything's set up. The family tickets for things are always 2 adults and children. So just the fact of perhaps not being able to do as much or get out and about as much, or, that can be really limiting, I think, for sure. And obviously childcare, massively expensive. If there was some kind of better infrastructure for that, I think that would be hugely helpful.
You wrote that point you made there about loneliness. You wrote a very lovely blog about loneliness. Just how did you cope with the isolation then?
It is difficult. I think having friends and family to talk to is important. But actually starting the blog was really useful from that point of view, because when I first set it up, which was 2009, which is a long time ago now in internet years, it did feel like much more of a sort of personal space and much more like the kind of traditional, what a blog originally was about, I guess, that kind of online journaling and sharing thoughts and feelings and getting feedback from other people in the same situation. So I remember, I think it was in the very first blog post I ever wrote, describing it as a second parent in the relationship. Somebody like the blog could take that role and be somewhere where I could ask questions that I didn't know about. I used to write about things like, how much pocket money am I meant to give to children? How old do they need to be to go to a sleepover? Like, I don't know any of these things. When my older daughter wanted to get her ears pierced when she was about 5, I think, I said, you've got to wait until you're 9. And I just picked a random number out that felt like a long time away. And then, of course, it got to her 9th birthday. And she was like, all right, I get my ears pierced now. And then when my younger daughter got to 9, the elder one said, oh, you get to have your ears pierced now. That's the rule in our family. You have to be 9. And I'm thinking, well, I'm just making these things up. I don't know.
I don't think you're alone on that one.
No. But yeah, I guess, so the internet generally is a useful tool, I think, for a lot of people, isn't it? To sort of reach out to people who are in the same situation.
Yeah. And what about, have you dated during this time as well? So have you introduced new people, or have you decided to stay away from that?
Yeah, so I have. It's 14 years now since I separated from Belle's dad. And in that time, I've had 2 serious relationships that lasted about 3 or 4 years each, where my partner has moved in with us as a family. So that's quite obviously that's a big thing to happen once, but that's happened twice. I've had other sort of less serious relationships in between, but I've not really for the last couple of years. And honestly, I really like it. It's so nice just not having to think about it. Or I don't know, I get kind of funny when I'm in a relationship. I think I lose my sense of self a little bit, and I get a bit too focused on the other person, and go a bit like weird and anxious. So it's been really nice to just have a couple of years of just not having to think about it at all. I'm finding it increasingly difficult to imagine myself in a new relationship.
I've started doing a little bit of dating, but I haven't really done anything where I've got to bring somebody home and introduce, and I'm just kind of wondering how that's going to be and what that's going to look like when the kids have gone so long without, another person being around.
And I think my kids as well, they just take the mick out of me, honestly, because I have such a weird, patchy relationship history. But also, everybody I date seems to be called John. I don't know why. So the last guy that I was in dated for about 9 months, my family called him John the Fourth to his face. So obviously that didn't go very well. So yeah, they just have a laugh at my expense, I think, about it.
Well, I've got a fridge magnet from my brother-in-law that says, if you are a man staying with Kate, please think twice. It's my fridge magnet. So I think he thinks if some random man is going to open my fridge and get out the milk to make a cup of tea in the morning, that might frighten him off.
That's a little message for him. Yeah, well, that's the kind of vibe that my kids go for, I think.
Yes. Yeah, it's quite funny. Oh, look, I'm conscious we're coming up to the end of time. If you had to leave people with some sort of choice tidbits in terms of how to survive and thrive being a solo parent, what would you say?
I think the key thing is what we were talking about with that idea of sort of seasons or chapters in your life. And if you can kind of get to that point of accepting that, all right, this isn't necessarily where you wanted to be or you imagined that you would be, but this is where you are, and that actually there are lots of things about your life now, I'm sure, that are positive and enjoyable, and just to kind of live in that moment, I guess, and to, nothing stays the same, does it? Everything changes. There'll be a point in 10 or 20 years' time where you'll be thinking, God, I wish I'd kind of held on to those moments. Yeah, that doesn't sound too naff.
Yeah, it sounds comforting. I mean, you tread a path and it has its ups and its downs. And like you say, I think it's about being present. It's about staying in the moment. It's about dealing with what's in front of you, not spending your life wishing that you weren't in this situation or just seeking out things that demonstrate to you you're not, in this relationship or that relationship, or you don't have this co-parenting relationship or that co-parenting relationship. And I think, we do set ourselves up sometimes, don't we? Instead of just being able to try and look at what the positives are in the situation we've got, to just try and emulate a better situation or a different one. And I'm not sure how helpful that is. So I hope if people are listening and they are solo parenting, they've come away with a sense of, well, yes, there are lots of positives about it. And there are lots of things that work well about solo parenting. And it is what it is, and we have every ability and right to make the best of it as we can.
You get the whole bed to yourself. I mean, that's got to be worth it, hasn't it?
Yes, absolutely. Love it. And where can people find out more about you, Jo?
Probably Instagram is the best place to come and find me. That's where I hang out most often. So I'm Slummy Single Mummy on Instagram. And I do things like share my favourite Tinder profiles in stories, which is always worth a laugh. So yeah, come and find me there and say hello.
That's brilliant. Thank you. And of course, you can find me. I'm on Twitter at Kate_Daly. You can hear more about new podcast episodes by following at divorce_podcast. And if you like this podcast and you like to listen to more, then please go to thedivorcepodcast.com and download further episodes. Jo, it's been lovely to talk to you. Thank you so much for sharing your solo parent journey with us. And thank you as well for listening.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Kate.